Chapter 9 of the book of Judges is a somewhat strange chapter when we first read it. The central character is a man called Abimelech. From the start to the finish of the chapter, he is presented as an unsavory and violent person. Yet we find a whole chapter consisting of 57 verses dealing primarily with him. So we need to dig deeper into what this story is all about, as there has to be some strong message contained therein for us. After all, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. This is one of a host of stories in the Old Testament that were recorded in the Bible for us to study, for us to analyze and to learn lessons. As Paul said, to be instructed by them so that we don't end up suffering the same fate as them. Now at this point, if you haven't read Judges chapter 9, you need to do so, as there's an enormous amount going on in the story, and it needs to be relatively fresh in your minds as we unpack what takes place. So, presuming you've read the story, let's set the scene. And we need to understand who, firstly, Abimelech is and where he actually came from. And so we pick up in the previous chapter in verse 31 that he was one of the sons of Gideon, but importantly, not from one of Gideon's many wives, but from a concubine or female servant. So straight away we know that he was an illegitimate offspring. Now, Gideon, you recall, was a renowned judge and military leader of the people of Israel, and he defeated the Midianites, freeing Israel from their oppression around about 1184 BC. And from this time onwards, until his death 40 years later, Israel had rest and lived in peace. Now Gideon, we're told in Judges 8 and verse 35, was also known as Jerubbaal. And as soon as Gideon dies, Israel starts to turn their backs on God again and revert to their old ways of worshipping Baal. Now, not long after the death of his father Gideon, Abimelech decides to establish himself as a ruler to replace Gideon. But he has 70 brothers who are all legitimate sons of Gideon, potentially standing in his way. And so he devises a ruthless plan to rise to power and be made king. What is not obvious from a first reading of Judges 9 is that Abimelech was most likely not a thoroughbred or true Israelite. Now we know that the Shechemites were definitely Jews. We're told in Numbers chapter 26 and verses 28 to 30 that they are descendants through the line from Joseph, Manasseh, Machir, and Gilead. And further we are told that Abimelech's mother was from Shechem. Her clan and family lived in Shechem. But when Jotham gives his parable and curse upon Abimelech and the people of Shechem, he refers to the trees looking to anoint a king and approaching the olive tree, the fig tree, and the vine. And all three of these refuse. And we know from the Bible that these three trees represent Israel in various forms. So in effect, Jotham is saying that no true Israelite wanted to be king over Israel because they knew that God was their true king. And so the trees then asked the bramble to be their king. The bramble, which was a thorny shrub, accepted. Now, brambles were often planted on graves to stop sheep from grazing there and represented pain and destruction. In essence, not a true Israelite, but rather the nations surrounding Israel that bring pain and destruction on them and rule over them from time to time. So most likely from Jotham's parable, we can infer that while his mother's clan were Shechemites, they had taken wives of the local Canaanites and were of mixed descent and not true Israelites. And so Abimelech hatches his plan and gets his mother's family, probably the more Canaanite side, to convince the leaders of Shechem that it would be better for him to rule over them, since he is more closely related to them than any of the 70 legitimate sons of Gideon. The leaders agree and give him money, 70 pieces of silver. And this money was taken from their Baal temple, called the house of Baal Berith. Abimelech then uses the money to hire what must have been a bunch of thugs and robbers to assist him. He arrives at Gideon's house in Ophrah and presumably is able to gain control by force over all Gideon's sons, barring one. And he then proceeds to kill or execute them all, himself, one by one, on a single stone. And so here we have him performing a type of sacrifice of the 69 brothers on that one stone. Jotham and all that mayhem must have somehow been able to hide himself and not get killed. Abimelech then goes back to Shechem, and its leaders and all the people of the nearby town of Beth Millo make him king. Jotham then gives his parable and his curse regarding the trees and says that if what they did was done with good faith and integrity, then they can afford to rejoice. But if not, then issues would arise between Abimelech and these two towns, and they would in effect devour each other. So Abimelech rules for 3 years, and then God causes issues to arise between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. It's most likely that the people soon realized that they had made a grave mistake in choosing Abimelech as their king, and they started revolting against his rule. After turning on each other, Abimelech eventually kills all the people of Shechem, destroys the city, plows it, and spreads salt on the fields so it would be useless for crops in the future. And he then corners the Shechem leaders in the Tower of Shechem and then sets it alight, killing over 1,000 people. Abimelech doesn't stop there. He next targets the city of Tbes. And I think we can assume that they too had joined the people of Shechem and revolted against Abimelech's rule. He lays siege to this city and eventually captures it. However, they too had a strong tower in the city, and the people fled into that for safety. While fighting against it, Abimelech comes too close to the tower walls, and a woman throws a millstone off the wall and catches Abimelech on his head, badly fracturing his skull. Realizing he's going to die, and not wanting to be remembered as having been killed by a woman, he asks his young armor-bearer to use his sword and kill him. So after that action-packed account of this very unsavory character Abimelech, what are we to learn and take away, as Paul instructed us to do? Abimelech's rise to power was marked by deception, by betrayal, by violence, and a total disregard for God's divine laws. We see in this account how the ambition and lust for power can ultimately turn men into beasts, into animals. This naked, unrestrained lust for control and power goes against all God's laws and the love we should have for one another. It sacrifices all that is good, all that is sacred, all that is valuable. Abimelech, in his lust for power, could not comprehend that it is better to look for ways to assist and help people than to want to be great, to want to be in power. And the thirst for power becomes an insatiable one. There is never enough of it. Abimelech was so proud and arrogant that he would rather destroy his family city and have all of them killed than have himself rejected as their king. In essence, he was saying, if I can't be your king, then I will wipe you off the face of the earth. Abimelech in the beginning used his charm and his guile to override any concerns the Shechemites might have had concerning him. And maybe they also turned a blind eye to his true objectives because they saw value in one of their own being made king. But little did they realize that they were dealing with a psychopath, and it was going to cost them and their families lives, and their city would be destroyed, plowed into the ground. Now we might feel that we are not an Abimelech and we are unlikely to come into contact with this type of person. But look closely at the spirit of Abimelech in a more modern context. Yes, his story is one of pure evil, but he represents exactly how not to behave in seeking a leadership role or if elected into a leadership position. This could be in the business world, at work, or more importantly, in taking up a leadership role in your church. Likewise, even if we ourselves are not chosen to lead, we have to be equally careful that those we choose or follow are well grounded in godly principles. To be careful of people who might try to draw us in and deceive us by their charm and manipulation. Paul gives us ample advice in 1 Timothy chapter 3 as to the qualities a leader should have. And as always, seek God earnestly in prayer when considering your choices. If the leaders of Shechem had been reading and studying the Word of God, they would have been better able to measure Abimelech against God's standards and seen their mistakes in looking to Him. So this gruesome story in Judges 9 should inspire us to always strive to live righteously, to seek God's guidance first, and to resist the temptation of pursuing power at the expense of others and of our own moral principles. By living our lives walking in the light of God and His Word and ensuring we act in humility and obedience, we can avoid the tragic consequences that we saw unfold in the lives of Abimelech and the Shechemites.